Sup guys, this is an in-depth guide on torpedoes in Azur lane, covering surface torpedoes. It's not going to be a quick tier list on the best torpedoes to use in general, so if that's what you're looking for, then you'll have to look elsewhere. If you happen to stumble upon this video first before any of my other in-depth equipment guides, I would advise you to first check the description for the in-depth equipment guides playlist, which contains guides covering much more important equipment types. At the very least, you should start with the main fleet equipment before moving on to vanguards. You also need to know what armor types are and how to find them to know what I'm talking about in this video. With that out of the way, let's get started. I'm first going to go over the basics and then talk about some of the relevant torpedo choices, and then at the end go over some situational considerations that are not super important but will enhance your understanding of the game. This is a page on the Azur lane wiki called List of Torpedoes. I'll leave a link to it in the description. First, I'll go over the properties, sometimes called the ballistics, of torpedoes. They have different ammo types, but knowing their name isn't as important as knowing how each property factors into effectiveness. Something to keep in mind as I talk about these stats though, is that there aren't a lot of different options to choose from. So if I tell you that lower torpedo speed is better, more often than not, that won't end up being the deciding factor on the torpedo you will ultimately choose, because you're not comparing two options that are otherwise the same, except for the speed. I'm just telling you what each of these mean, so that you can get a full understanding, and maybe in the future it could actually be the case that there's a new torpedo that is the exact same as an old one, except for the speed, or any kind of these mountain properties, in which case you'll instantly know that this one is better because of this, this, and this. Okay, so torpedo speed is pretty self-explanatory. It's how fast the torpedo travels after being launched. However, what is good in this case is actually the opposite of most other equipment types. The slower the torpedo, the better its hit rate will be, at least on auto, which is how most people play most of the time. The reason for this is because torpedoes are rarely aimed, like most other types of equipment. Even though on auto, if a target is detected by a ship before launching their torpedoes, they will fire their torpedoes at the target, but most torps still fan out in a fixed cone pattern, with most of the individual torps not being directly on target. And if the torp launcher has an even number of torpedoes, then none of the torps will actually be directly fired at the target. What this means is that, let's say you launch a round of 5 torpedoes at an enemy and they travel at the speed of light, you'll only hit the one directly aimed at the target. If you launch a round of 2 or 4 at the speed of light, then 0 will land. On the other hand, if they moved very slowly at 1 unit per second, they'll essentially end up being mines that an enemy will eventually stumble into at some point. Torpedoes obviously don't actually move that fast or slow, so these extreme examples are just to convey the idea that lower speed means that the torpedoes linger longer on the field, increasing the likelihood that they'll eventually make contact with some kind of enemy. And this is in contrast with other weapon types like straight guns on vanguards, arcing guns on battleships and large cruisers, and aimed torpedo bombers on carriers and so on, where the attacks are aimed directly at a target, so the faster they are, the less time the target has to move out of the way before the attack arrives. Next up is the homing properties. You can think of turning rate intuitively as the homing strength of a torpedo. 48 degrees per second means that a torpedo can make at most a 48-degree turn in 1 second to track down a target, and then 33 degrees would be slightly worse. Turn radius is probably just another way to express the same property. If I'm wrong on that, somebody please write a comment and explain what the turn radius means and how it differs from turning rate, because I'm not 100% sure. Then, the homing range is how far away a torpedo can find a target. Next, we have the spread, which is the angle between the two furthest torpedoes in a salvo. Some ships, for instance Harbin, and then a lot of Aegean destroyers, and for some reason Trafalgar, have a perk that reduces the spread of their torpedoes, and this table shows the exact value of that effect. The last and barely relevant properties to highlight are the angle, not to be confused with the spread, and specifically the firing range and not the shell range under this SH column. If you've seen the Vanguard gun guides, you probably already know what these mean. Both of these properties only have an effect on autoplay. They dictate the area an enemy has to be within for the torpedo to lock onto them when they're firing, although once again, the fixed spread of most torpedoes makes it so that whether the torpedoes lock onto something or not won't make a huge difference. The shell range means that the torpedoes will fizzle out after traveling a certain amount of units within this range, but you'll never run into a situation where one torpedo is worse than another because it fizzles out too quickly, which is the case for some Vanguard guns. So in the case of torpedoes, it can be ignored. Now, getting into the actual practical application of how you would choose which torpedoes to use, there's actually a very small pool to choose from for each situation. Similar to main fleet equipment, torpedoes have pretty long cooldowns, so their DPS values are not representative of performance. More often than not, two torpedoes with a few seconds of difference in cooldown will launch a different number of times in a battle, and then the one that gets more salvos will likely deal more total damage. Unlike other equipment types, you don't really have to worry about armor types because all of the torpedoes have the same 80, 110, 130 armor mods, with one exception, but that one exception is not different for the better. On auto, against a single enemy, anything that isn't homing will land a single torpedo most of the time, maybe two occasionally if the Vanguard just happens to get very close to the enemy by their random movement. Magnetic homing torpedoes will land a little bit more than 2 on average with the normal spread, and then close to 3 with the reduced spread perk mentioned earlier. So for all content featuring a single enemy done on auto, you should only really be considering these 4 sets of torpedoes here, as they're the only homing options available. First, I'm going to talk about the regular gold quad mags and rainbow quint mags. At a glance, you might be tempted to assume that the rainbow higher rarity one is a direct upgrade. After all, it gives 25 more torpedo stat, fires an extra torpedo with the same damage, and while it has longer cooldown, its DPS numbers are still higher. So, what is wrong with this evaluation? First, having an extra torpedo per salvo doesn't directly translate to hitting an extra torpedo per salvo. While yes, the rainbow quints will hit more torpedoes on average, the gain in expected hits is less than 1 because the spread between each torpedo stays the same, meaning that the total spread is 12 degrees more, and then the outside torpedoes are aimed wider than with the quads. Next, I already mentioned that the DPS numbers are not representative of their performance already, and often misleading. The quint mags are just a little too slow to the point where in many battles, they will result in 1 less total torpedo salvo launched compared to the quads, completely erasing the advantage they had in firing more torpedoes. And this isn't just speculation based on looking at their numbers either. I have some past videos documenting my various methods of testing the 2 torpedoes in-game, and the results do align with what I just said. There are contrarians on every topic, but I don't think I've seen anyone claim that the rainbow quints are better than the quad mags in a long time. Now, despite all that, I wouldn't call the quad mags a direct upgrade to the quint mags. There are more situations where the quad mags are better, but there are situations occasionally where the rainbow mags are definitely better. Some examples of these are when the battle doesn't last very long. In that case, cooldown doesn't matter when you're only dumping your preload and the battle ends before the torpedoes even finish reloading. That also applies to battles that just happen to end during times where both torpedoes launch the same number of times. If external factors like timed buffs and debuffs aren't accounted for, the rainbow quints should result in more damage. Another case where you might want to use the rainbow quints is when the ship has a pretty weak torpedo slot, but somehow strong torpedo scaling barrages. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, and maybe there isn't even one, because the ships that have strong torpedo barrages probably have strong torpedo slots as well, but in that case, the extra 25 torpedo stat might be enough to swing things in the rainbow quints' favor. One important factor that make the rainbow quints a much less tempting offer is their accessibility and upgrade cost, costing 360 gold plates to bring to plus 13, enough to upgrade 3 sets of quad mags to the same level. Personally, I would fully upgrade at least 3 sets of quad mags to plus 13 before I even consider using the rainbow quints for anything. Moving on, there are the improved quad mags, which are event limited, but an actual direct upgrade over the regular quad mags, having everything the same except higher base damage and bigger homing range. If you have these, I hope you can put 2 and 2 together and use them instead of the regular quad mags. Then, these USS homing torpedoes can be ignored for the most part. You can see here that the spread stat is very low. Torpedoes with 10 degrees of spread or lower fire in more of a straight line at whatever the target is, or straight ahead if they can't find one, similar to actually many Vanguard guns that have the same spread. The difference here is that the speed is a lot lower than Vanguard guns, meaning it is very likely that the enemy will be long gone from where they were aimed at by the time they arrive, especially if they're moving vertically at all. And its much weaker homing capability compared to the Ironblood magnetic torpedoes due to the lower turn rate doesn't really help either. The only time I would really consider them would be when the enemy doesn't move at all, in which case you're erasing one part of its inconsistency, the fact that it is likely to completely whiff if the enemy is moving vertically. In that case, it has the potential to nail all 4 torps on the target's head, but also has the potential to completely whiff if the Vanguard ventures a bit too far off to one side and they don't lock onto the enemy. This is a trade-off you'll have to weigh after trying out both of them against a specific enemy. If there is an improvement over using the Ironblood homing torpedoes though, it likely won't be a huge one, so it's really okay to just ignore them. Also, these can hit submarines, but they deal severely reduced damage against submarines and end up being wasted if they do collide with submarines. Submarines aren't really an issue as of right now, provided you just use a Hedgehog, so it's not really worth considering at all. Okay, that about wraps up Situation 1, which again was one enemy on auto. Next, we have fights with multiple enemies active at the same time, mostly found in campaign, still on auto mode. In this case, homing torpedoes are still great, but it's also okay to use non-homing torpedoes. Most of the homing torpedoes will home in on a target in front of the Vanguard, whereas straight torpedoes with a normal spread will end up hitting more enemies. Their effectiveness will also depend on the particular stage you're doing. In some earlier campaign stages, there might only be 2 enemies active on the field at a time, in which case you would be better off just sticking to the homing torpedoes. But it doesn't really matter much what you use in those early stages anyway. When you get to the super late game stages, there are many more enemies active at a time, and a pretty good chance that you'll land a lot of hits even with straight torpedoes. I wouldn't consider them a strict upgrade over homing torpedoes, even when there are a lot of enemies, and in general, most of the stronger ones also have longer cooldowns, so which one you use will have trade-offs, but you don't really have to worry about which specific non-homing torpedo is necessarily the best, and just use whatever you have in your storage from events or equipment boxes. I wouldn't suggest going out of your way to craft the best set of straight torpedoes. Now, I want to talk about torpedo options for a manual, which I haven't done for any other equipment type because manual play opens up the possibility of using extremely powerful torpedoes that are completely unviable on auto. The 2 specific torpedoes I'm referring to are the Rainbow Quintuple 610 and the HMS Straight Torps. First, the Quintuple 610 is just a straight firing torp with an extremely long cooldown, but deals the highest total damage in a single salvo. They're only the best option when you can run your Vanguard right into the enemy, literally touching the enemy you're trying to hit, which is only possible on manual and for glowworm retrofit. Outside of manual, like I said before, they can be used in campaign, just like all the other non-homing torpedoes, but they're not necessarily the best for anything on auto, and I'd consider them in the same bracket of use them if you have them from an event, but don't bother crafting them with your operations hour materials. The HMS Straight Torps, similar to the USS Homing Torps I talked about earlier, fire in a line and not a cone. Since they don't have homing capability, they have higher damage to compensate, a lot higher in fact, with the higher base and an extra torpedo on top, which is a pattern you'll notice with pretty much all straight torpedoes compared to homing ones. This makes them the best option when playing on manual against an enemy that deals a lot of damage, and you can't afford to plant your Vanguard face first into them. And using these, you could snipe them from one side of the screen to the other with good accuracy. Okay, that actually covers all the most commonly used torpedoes. It's really just the 2 real different magnetic torpedoes for auto, and then the 2 non-homings for manual, and it pretty much ends there. Now, I'll go over a few of the special equipment that are also in this category. First up are the DDG missiles. The SY-1A is just straight up better in every way, but currently event limited, whereas the SY-1 can be obtained via the core data shop. They don't actually compete with torpedoes at all, because the ships that can equip these can't equip torpedoes in the same slot, so you don't exactly have a choice. These are automatically fired, and can't be held onto like torpedo salvos on manual. They also can't physically miss, although they still have to go through the hit rate check like all other attacks. When you compare their damage to regular torpedoes, you can see just how much stronger they are, on top of having a 100% hit rate, and also ammo mods skewed toward light armor, and all of that are a large part of the reason why the guided missile destroyers that use them are so strong against the light armor, and also solid against medium. Next up are these French torpedoes, which, similar to the missiles, and unlike all the other torpedoes in the game, have light skewed ammo mods. However, this doesn't make them better than using homing torpedoes against a light armor boss for auto, because like I mentioned earlier, most of the time it'll only land a single torpedo, which will end up being weaker than the homing torpedoes that land a little over 2 hits per salvo on average. If, for some unholy reason, you're using a torpedo-focused vanguard against a light armor enemy on manual, even though there are much better options, then yeah, this French torpedo will actually deal the most damage when you face torp that light armor enemy, even more than the Rainbow Quint 610 because of its special ammo mods. After that, there are the so-called fast torpedoes. This blue twin one is the fastest, and its damage is pitiful. The purple triple is slightly slower, although not by much, but its total damage is quite a bit higher. And then there's also the New Sardinia one from PR8, which is just a little bit slower than the purple triple, but deals a bit more total damage and has a slightly different 2x2 pattern. Now, these are only really good when it's more important to activate a ship's skill that is tied to their torpedoes than it is to deal damage with the torpedoes. For instance, when Anchorage fires her torpedoes, she fires an extra barrage and also activates a smokescreen that protects any Vanguard ship inside it. Another one is Scylla, who has pretty mediocre torpedo stats, but her torpedo launch activates an extremely powerful barrage. However, these faster torps are not a lot faster than regular torps, compared to fast destroyer guns, for example, which have less than half the cooldown of the slower, stronger guns. This means that, even if there is a gain, it's not going to be a significant one, so you can just stick to the generic recommendations and do just fine. Now, I'll talk about some of the nuances that you might want to consider when equipping your fleet with torpedoes. The first is timing. Since it's fresh on your mind, let's use Anchorage as an example again. I just mentioned how she activates a smokescreen when she uses her torpedoes, right? While it's true that you'll get more total smokescreens with a faster torp than a slower one, that might not be ideal. If you've ever seen any boss fight in the game, you probably have noticed that the bosses have fixed attack patterns, and it's never just the same attack constantly throughout the battle. You could have a boss that barely deals any damage, but once every 30 seconds or so does a hugely powerful attack that almost kills your Vanguard entirely. In that case, even though these faster torpedoes with a cooldown of under 20 seconds will activate one smoke at 19.4 seconds, the second at about 39 seconds, and the third at 58 seconds, all these activations will not be able to protect you the moment it actually matters. On the other hand, the slowest torpedoes on this list, the Rainbow Quint Magnetic Torpedoes, will activate the smokescreen at 29.4 seconds, massively reducing the damage from the big attack. Another example is A-Gear, who slows enemies hit by her torpedoes by 60% by 5 seconds. To really make use of this effect, you need to hit at least one torpedo, and hit it right before the big attacks from your main fleet to apply the slow. In this case, it's not really about how fast or slow the torpedo is, or how strong or weak it is, but just getting that exact timing down. That is why I have a few of these triple homing torps at various upgrade levels from back when A-Gear was used in essentially every boss fleet, because you still need a homing torpedo for the consistency, but the quad mags were just a little too slow. The next consideration is timing your torpedoes for campaign. Let's say you're in some stage where enemies have 10k HP. Now, let's say your Vanguard has Unzen, who by herself deals more than 10k damage when she launches her torps, since she has really strong torpedoes to begin with, but also reloads 2 salvos at a time. If you just give your entire Vanguard the same torpedoes, let's say the quad mags, they'll all launch one after the other, but Unzen's torps alone already kills most of the enemies on the screen at the time, so the rest of your torpedoes will go to waste. Instead, you should try to choose torpedoes that are a few seconds slower than the ones Unzen is using, so that they hit the next wave of enemies. You also have to consider the main fleet attacks though, because you'll run into the same issue if, say, your Musashi is firing at the same time Unzen is launching her torps, resulting in a lot of overkill. If your Vanguard has weaker torpedoes though, let's say you're using something like Laffy 2, Eldritch Retrofit, and San Diego or something, then all of their torpedoes combined will barely do 10k, if even, so it's probably going to be fine to give them all the same torpedoes. While thinking about a proper torpedo setup for a campaign is optimal, I don't want to exaggerate the gain that you would get from it. Even if you don't carefully consider your torpedo timings and reduce overkill as much as you can, You'll still probably manage just fine with an overall well-constructed fleet, so think about it if you want, but it's not that important. Okay, I think that's about everything I want to cover in this guide. There was also a neat little interaction with Mogador's lunge attack and the Rainbow Quint mags that came in handy in a few previous boss fights, but I don't think it's relevant anymore with the addition of Z52 in Trafalgar, so I'll just leave a link to an old video where I talk about it for curiosity's sake. I hope you found this guide helpful. Let me know in the comments if there was anything that was difficult to understand, and I'll try to clarify. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.